Chapter 4, Theological Context, Amenemope and the Hebrew Bible.
The last person I would trust to tell me what to believe would be an Egyptologist. A well-respected professor of Hebrew and biblical history, Paul clearly had an affinity for biblical history.
Scrolls, tablets, and biblical wisdom.
In the latter half of the 19th century, archaeologists began recovering and deciphering large numbers of ancient texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia, thereby making them available to modern scholarship for the first time. The biggest impact came from early translations of the cuneiform tablets recovered from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, some of which bore an uncanny resemblance to the early chapters of the biblical book of Genesis. But as early as 1857, it was observed that there were also striking similarities between certain Egyptian writings and a number of biblical texts. And over the course of the next 65 years, it became increasingly clear that some of the Egyptian instructions were strikingly similar in form, style, and even content to the biblical books of Proverbs, Sirach, and the Wisdom of Solomon. While some of the Egyptian pessimistic literature was more than a little reminiscent of Job and Ecclesiastes. These 5 books had long been yoked together by students of the Bible as wisdom literature because they are the ones whose major themes most often center around the terms MK equals wise and AMFK equals wisdom, or their Greek equivalents Sopho/V and Sophie/A. The Song of Songs was also traditionally considered a wisdom book because of its traditionally Solomonic origins, despite the fact that it has no wisdom content as that term is understood by modern scholarship. There is also overt wisdom instruction in portions of the Book of Tobit and the Book of Baruch. This biblical wisdom literature was held in high esteem during the patristic era. For example, in a Christian tradition going back at least to the 3rd century theologian Origen, it was held that Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs were designed by Solomon himself as an ascending sequence of spiritual discipline. Proverbs teaches the beginning student about moral discernment and proper behavior. Ecclesiastes teaches the more advanced student a contempt for the things of this world and awakens a desire for something higher. And the Song of Songs uses a mystical allegory of love to instruct the initiate in the things of eternity. The same ideas and the same sort of reverence for the biblical wisdom literature continued and even increased during the Middle Ages. But with the coming of the Protestant Reformation and the shift of Christian theological concern to issues of soteriology and ecclesiology, the wisdom literature fell into disfavor in the West. Sirach, the Wisdom of Solomon, Tobit, and Baruch were ejected from the Protestant canon entirely. The 3 wisdom books which remained, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, were either reinterpreted in terms of Reformation theology or else rejected outright as invalid, illegitimate, wholly secular, theologically unsound, an alien body inherently deficient, devoid of religious faith, contaminated, bankrupt, and even paganism pure and simple. As a result, by the beginning of the 20th century, wisdom literature had become an orphan in the biblical household, and study of it was largely moribund. So while the fact of Mesopotamian influence on the biblical narrative was quickly embraced by the academic community, and indeed spurred something of a renaissance in scholarly study of the Book of Genesis, the new Egyptian documents received considerably less attention, and their relevance to biblical studies was only hesitatingly admitted. As late as the end of the 19th century, it was still possible for such a respected scholar as A. Sayce to state that while Mesopotamian elements pervaded the Hebrew Bible, the influence of Egypt upon Israel may be described as negative. He explained, Egypt was a land of culture, it was a land of wealth and abundance, but it was also a land of popular superstition and idolatry. And the idolatry and the culture were too closely associated in the minds of the Israelites to be torn apart. In turning their backs on the Egyptian idols, it was necessary that they should turn them on Egyptian civilization as well. Perhaps it was statements like this which drove one respected Egyptologist, T. Eric Peat, to complain in 1923 about biblical scholars who still feel a traditional resentment at any attempt to treat the biblical narrative like any other ancient document, and to expose it to the full light of modern discovery, and therefore are either unacquainted with or purposely ignore the fruits of Egyptological inquiry.
And then came Amenemope.
But in the very year of Peat's discontent, the situation began to change dramatically with Budge's publication of the complete text of the Instruction of Amenemope. The scroll on which that text resided, Papyrus 10,474, had been sitting virtually untouched in the British Museum for 35 years. Now, however, it was published in full, with photo facsimiles of the original hieratic, a hieroglyphic transcription, and a first attempt at a translation. This was followed a year later by a second transcription and translation with extensive commentary. The effects of these publications, not only for Egyptology but even more so for biblical studies, and especially for the relationship between the two fields, would be immense and irreversible. As we have already seen in Chapter 3, Budge himself said at the time of Papyrus 10,474's publication that the system of religious morality, which Amenemope reveals, is of a very high character, and in many particulars closely resembles that which has hitherto been regarded as almost exclusively the property of ancient Semitic and Sumerian peoples. Parallels to some of its precepts can be found in the Pentateuch, the Psalms, and the Proverbs of Solomon, and it is impossible not to wonder whether these at least are not due to some Asiatic influence, which found its way into Egypt under the Middle Empire, or about the time of the rule of the Hyksos over Lower Egypt. Whether this be so or not, I cannot believe that they are of African or native Egyptian origin. He went on to point out specific parallels of thought and language between Amenemope and the Hebrew Bible, including the injunction that poverty with peace is better than riches with strife. Amenemope 158, 306, Proverbs 116 to 306, Proverbs 15:17. The imagery of ill-gotten gains sprouting wings and flying away, Amenemope 177 to 178, Proverbs 23:05. The imagery of God as the divine builder, Amenemope 4882 and 4884, Psalm 127. 1. The sufficiency of God. The imagery of resting in the arms of God, Amen 4.43, Amen 4.53, Amen 4.57, the metaphor of the well-watered tree, Amenemope 102 to 107, Psalm 103. The danger of consorting with gossips and loudmouths, Amenemope 215 to 240, Psalm 55:21. Of these alleged parallels, only the first two were proposed in Budge's 1923 publication of the hieroglyphic text, and these only in brief footnotes. The remainder had to wait until his 1924 commentary, and by that time, others were already on the same trail. The first to publish was H.O. Lange, who had brought out a Danish translation of Amenemope in January 1924. This, in turn, provided the inspiration for several articles by the eminent German scholar Adolf Ehrmann, who in April published a review of both Budge's 1923 volume and Lange's translation, followed in May by his own translation of Amenemope into German and his own list of apparent parallel, Amenemope 5 with Proverbs 22:21 on refuting accusations, Amenemope 47:54 with Proverbs 4:20, 5:01, 22:17, and 18, Psalm 78:1. Give your ear to wisdom, Amenemope 61 with Proverbs 22:22 through 23. Don't attack the weak, Amenemope 92 and 426 to 433 with Proverbs 20:22. Don't take revenge, Amenemope 1026 to 127 with Proverbs 22:28 and 23:10. Don't displace border markers, Amenemope 151 and 313 and 3316 with Proverbs 15:16 and 17, 16:8, 17:01, and Ecclesiastes 4:6, also noted in part by Budge. Amenemope 1067, 1078 with Proverbs 23:04, 5, already noted by Budge. Amenemope 207 to 208 with Proverbs 22:24. Don't fraternize with hotheads, Amenemope 332, 368 with Proverbs 16:11. Don't use false weights and measures, Amenemope 370, 371, 430, 431, and 455 to 456 with Proverbs 27:01. Don't worry about tomorrow, Amenemope 377 with Proverbs 29:9. Don't claim to be without sin, Amenemope 436-441 with Proverbs 2019, don't fraternize with gossips. Amenemope 464 with Proverbs 23:01 and 3. Don't let food be your downfall. Amenemope 478-481 with Proverbs 17:05. Don't mock the downtrodden. Amenemope 539 with Proverbs 22:20. I have written 30 sayings. Ehrman also noted that the bulk of these parallels were located in a narrowly bounded section of the book of Proverbs entitled The Words of the Wise, 22:17, 24:22. In fact, they were restricted to the first third of that section, with the last parallel ending at 23:10. Of all the parallels unearthed by Ehrman, the last one on the list above is by far the most important, since it bears directly on another issue originally raised by Budge. If there really was some sort of connection between Amenemope and Proverbs, which direction did the influence flow? As we have seen, Budge himself was convinced that the thought world of Amenemope was heavily Semitic, and therefore that the influence must have gone from Asia to Africa. But Ehrman used a single word in the book of Proverbs to demonstrate that the influence must have gone in the other direction. That word was mu'elim, which stood in the Masoretic Hebrew text of Proverbs 22:20. Have I not written for you, mu'elim of counsel and knowledge? The word had been a problem for translators for a very long time, and no one really knew what it meant. The Hebrew text as written, the ketib had mo, 3 days ago, which could plausibly be stretched to mean something like previously. The Hebrew text as pronounced, ibo, kere, had mo, efit, salism, equals officers, which some thought might just barely be stretched to mean chief things. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation which was even older than the traditional Masoretic recension of the Hebrew, had ignored both the ketib and the kire and translated the mystery word as triswavi, threefold. The Vulgate similarly rendered it as triplicator, in 3 ways. Neither made much sense in context. Ehrman's solution was based on the close parallelism between Proverbs 22:20 and Amenemope 539 through 549. Have I not written for you, MILL counsel and knowledge? See for yourself these 30 chapters. They are pleasant. They instruct. As it turns out, the Hebrew word for 30 is mailil. So all that was required to make the Hebrew consistent with the Egyptian was to change the wa of the ketib to a yod, and then repoint the vowels. A less radical change than the traditional alteration from the ketib to the kere, and one that made better sense in context. This solution not only resolved a long-standing problem in biblical studies, but also proved the direction of influence. The Egyptian text made perfect sense as it stood, without any help from the Hebrew. After all, Amenemope was indeed divided into 30 explicitly numbered chapters, just as line 539 declared. The corresponding Hebrew text, on the other hand, was apparently corrupt and made little or no sense until amended by reference to the Egyptian, and even then, it was questionable what the word 30 might refer to in the context of the book of Proverbs. It was highly improbable that an Egyptian scribe would have created a text of 30 carefully numbered chapters based on a vague suggestion from a corrupt Hebrew text, whose own 30 chapters were not clearly demarcated or easily discerned. It was, however, quite plausible that an Israelite editor with the text of Amenemope in front of him, or perhaps an abridged and edited translation of it, might mechanically preserve Amenemope's reference to 30 chapters, even if it made little or no sense in its new context. In short, the many parallels between the two texts left little doubt that there was some sort of relationship between them, and the comparison of Proverbs 22:20 with Amenemope line 539 left little doubt about which direction that relationship went. The author of Amenemope could not have borrowed from Proverbs, so the editor of Proverbs must have borrowed from Amenemope. As one observer later summarized Ehrman's theory, in the Persian period, perhaps, one of the Jews who was then living in Egypt became acquainted with the wisdom of Amenemope, which was probably used as a school textbook. He made this accessible to his fellow believers by translating it into Hebrew, or possibly Aramaic. He substituted Yahweh for God and made such other changes as would make it suitable for the Jews. He left it divided into 30 chapters. But this excellent little book had the misfortune to fall into the hands of collectors of proverbs and sentences who did not go about their work very intelligently. Finally, in a much mutilated form, part of it was incorporated into the collection which makes up the third section of our book of Proverbs. While almost everyone quibbled with the specific details of Ehrman's hypothesis, his main point, that amenemope had exerted a major influence on the words of the wise in Proverbs 22:17 to 24:22, was widely accepted by mainstream scholarship and quickly assumed the mantle of an assured result. We shall therefore refer to this viewpoint from now on as the Ehrman consensus. It is important, however, to keep in mind that there was consensus only about the single fact of Amenemope's influence on the words of the wise, regarding such specifics as dates of composition, routes of transmission, the existence or absence of intermediate documents, the exact nature and chronology of Amenemope's influence on Proverbs, and many other related issues. There was endless controversy and a constant production of hypotheses and refutations. Unfortunately, some of the baggage which Ehrman himself attached to his hypothesis, such as the no subtle implication that the compilers of Holy Writ were incompetent bunglers and mutilators, was certain to provoke an outraged response from someone or other. Ultimately, this would lead to a series of counterattacks against the priority of Amenemope, which would muddy the waters for years to come.
A new generation of wisdom research.
Budge's publication of Amenemope and Ehrman's groundbreaking thesis proved to be a potent combination. Scholarly interest in the biblical wisdom books quickly revived, and over the next few years, what had once been a stagnant trickle turned into a veritable torrent. It began with reviews of and responses to Budge's 1923 publication of the full text, to Ehrman's essay on the relationship with Proverbs, and finally to Budge's 1924 commentary. These were followed by more substantial efforts as various scholars began to engage the text directly and started making their own discoveries of alleged parallels, which seemed to be popping up everywhere. One of the most prolific practitioners of parallelomania, as it later came to be called by some, was Hugo Gressman, who claimed to have found traces of Amenemope throughout the Hebrew Bible, including not only additional parallels in Proverbs, but also in Leviticus, Samuel, Psalms, Jeremiah, and Job. In opposition to Ehrman, however, Gressman made the important point that the reference to 30 chapters in Proverbs 22:20 was not necessarily a meaningless artifact of a mindlessly mechanical translation by an incompetent Israelite editor. In fact, it made perfect sense in its new context if it referred not to the book of Proverbs as a whole, as Ehrman had assumed, but only to the words of the wise in Proverbs 22:17 to 24-22, a standalone section of Proverbs which could indeed be divided into 30 distinct sayings. The contrast between the two positions was ably summarized by Griffith. Professor Ehrman suggested that at some time a Hebrew or Aramaic version was made of the Proverbs of Amenemope, and that the compiler of the biblical book of Proverbs utilized this translation but corrupted the sense in borrowing. Dr. Gressman shows, however, that the borrowing was not a direct copying of words, but an absorption of ideas which then reappeared in new forms according to requirements. The outstanding example in Ehrman's view was the word 30, which he thought a useless and meaningless survival in its new context. But the explanation is this: Amenemope's teaching had been arranged in 30 houses or chapters. Hence, the Hebrew compiler of the third section of Proverbs adopted that number as a basis for his collection, which he proceeded to make up of 30 maxims, and thus quite appropriately refers to them in a phrase similar to that used by Amenemope in referring to his own composition. The year 1925 marked a major turning point in the study of Amenemope, for it was during this year that H.O. Lung published his magisterial translation and commentary based on his own independent transcription of the hieratic. Unlike Budge's commentary, which had been slapdash and shallow, Lung's was deep and scholarly, and was based not only on Papyrus 10,474, but also on the Turin 6237 writing tablet. It is still a valuable resource even today. Shortly thereafter, Hermann Reinke published another German translation of Amenemope in a collection of Egyptian texts edited by Gressman. It was also during this year that the first significant works on Amenemope appeared in English, notably a conference paper by Marion Dunsmar, which was read before the American Oriental Society in Evanston. After summarizing and evaluating the numerous parallels which had been alleged between Amenemope and Proverbs, Dunsmar drew 5 conclusions which remain unchallenged to this day, for both accuracy and perspicuity. Amenemope is the nearest thing we have to an original source document for the Hebrew Bible, and it gives us, for the first time, a way to directly measure and observe how source materials were utilized, mutilated, and adapted by compilers. Amenemope proves that at least one Egyptian text was taken over and adapted by the Hebrews, and suggests the possibility that similar treatment may have been accorded to others. Amenemope confirms the claim often made by modern commentators that the Hebrew text of Proverbs contains significant corruptions. Amenemope demonstrates that some of those corruptions already existed when the Septuagint was made, and that the Septuagint translators introduced other corruptions or misinterpretations of their own. Amenemope shows that the commentators' speculative emendations of the Hebrew text are sometimes surprisingly accurate. These conclusions, although solidly grounded in the textual evidence, were to some not only staggering in their implications, but quite simply unacceptable. No doubt they added considerable fuel to the fire which Ehrman had already started. Despite the fact that Amenemope had originally been published in England, to this point almost everything else that had been done on the subject had come out of Germany. Now, in 1926, other sectors of the international academic community began to weigh in. Two of the most important contributions that year were published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology. The first of these was F.L.L. Griffith's English translation and commentary, which was based on Lange's work of the previous year. It provided the first in-depth look at Amenemope in the English language, and is still a valuable resource even today. The other article by D.C. Simpson recapitulated and extended the comparisons between Amenemope and the Book of Proverbs, and on that basis not only supported the priority of Amenemope, but also concluded that all the parallels, when considered in the aggregate, provide a chain of cumulative evidence which compels the unprejudiced student to go further and to formulate the hypothesis that the proverbial literature of the Near East knew no national boundaries but was international. It must have been common alike to Mesopotamia and to Egypt. It must have been as gladly welcomed and assimilated by the Hebrews as by their neighbors. The resemblances, moreover, to the teaching of Amenophis, though most numerous in the Book of Proverbs, are by no means confined to that book. Traces, some of them clear, others dubious, of the influence of this Egyptian work have been pointed out in all the various types of Hebrew literature which have been preserved in the Old Testament. This conclusion, based in large part on the earlier work of Gressman, would become one of the central themes of the discussion in coming years. The next few years saw additional English-language articles on Amenemope by Mercer and Keimer, articles in German by Setha and Bloch, and a Spanish translation and commentary by Rosenwasser. The French, who were relative latecomers, quickly closed the gap with significant contributions of their own. Waynans Runde provided a complete translation of Amenemope into French. Milan summarized the current state of research, discussed the parallels with Proverbs, provided an annotated translation into Latin, and strongly supported the dependence of Proverbs on Amenemope. 57 Leffert compared Amenemope with the precepts of St. Pachomius, a 4th century Egyptian convert to Christianity, who became one of the founders of Christian monasticism. Lexa provided another French translation, a sophisticated literary analysis, and a compelling essay refuting the suggestions of Lyon Griffith that the theology of Amenemope was essentially monotheistic.
The first counterattack.
By this point, almost everyone who entered the discussion felt it necessary to make at least a passing reference to the many parallels which Budge, Ehrman, Gressman, and others had found between Amenemope and the Hebrew Bible. And virtually everyone who took up the issue supported the position of the Ehrman consensus that at least in the case of the words of the wise in Proverbs 22:24, Amenemope had a clear claim to priority. Inevitably, however, there was a reaction against the consensus. One of the first to raise serious objections was W.O.E. Oesterle, a professor of Hebrew and Old Testament exegesis at King's College, London. Though he was, by his own admission, not an Egyptologist, he nevertheless felt it necessary to present a somewhat different view from that hitherto held as to the nature of the relationship between Amenemope and the Old Testament. In a brief article which he subsequently expanded into a full-length book, Oesterle argued that while there was undeniably some relationship between Amenemope and Proverbs, The scattered and disorganized nature of the alleged borrowings did not support the idea of direct dependence in either direction. He proposed, rather, that many of the similarities between the two works resulted simply from the fact that both of them drew heavily upon the common stock of the international wisdom tradition of the ancient Near East, whose existence and importance were increasingly being recognized by scholars. To demonstrate the widespread diffusion of wisdom motifs and vocabulary, he gave the example of the Proverbs of Ahikar. This 7th century collection of Aramaic proverbs from Syria, framed by a later narrative tale, was popularly known from the 5th century Jewish colony at Elephantine in Egypt to ancient Greece, where part of it was appropriated for the life of Aesop. Its motifs, expressions, and proverbial statements exhibit numerous parallels to Proverbs and other biblical texts, but except for the Book of Tobit, which explicitly acknowledges its connection with Ahikar and indeed makes him a part of its story, it is impossible to prove who borrowed from whom. As Esterly put it, what is therefore to be gathered from such a comparison is that, while there may have been borrowing on the part of one or the other writer, there is also the possibility, perhaps probability, that neither borrowed, but that a mass of material had gradually accumulated, largely by means of oral teaching which had become general property and which was utilized by different writers, and modified according to individual taste. In this way, the same thought would appear in different settings. As for those parallels which could not be thus explained, Esterly maintained that they were more likely to have come from a previously existing written document which was used independently by the authors of both Amenemope and Proverbs. So far as wisdom, pure and simple, is concerned, we would not for a moment deny the influence of Egypt on Israel. But where it is a question of religion and ethics, we contend that Amenemope and probably other Egyptian thinkers of like exalted mentality were more likely to have been influenced by the Hebrew genius than that Israelite religious leaders should have borrowed from Egypt. But when could the Israelites have exercised such an influence upon Egyptian thinking? At least until after the time of Israel's king Ahab, Oesterle said, the Egyptians were culturally so far advanced over the Israelites that, at least from the Egyptian perspective, Israel would simply have had nothing to offer. Only with the teachings of the 8th century prophets did Israel have something that might impress and therefore influence her neighbors, and even this would have taken time to ripen. Esterly therefore proposed the late 7th century BC as the most likely time for Israel's religious ideals to have penetrated Egypt, an era which, for Israel, was a time of immense religious creativity, cosmopolitan vision, and a fervor for proselytization, but for Egypt was a time of national weakness when foreign influences might have found fertile soil. Esterly's own summing up put it succinctly: assuming, as we do, that Amenemope was written after the high ethical teaching of the prophets had taken root and fructified among the finer spirits of their nation, it is a priori more likely that Amenemope would be influenced by the Old Testament writers than vice versa. But therein lay the rub, as Esterly himself realized. If, as he believed, Amenemope was indeed composed during the late 7th or early 6th centuries BC, then anything was possible. If, on the other hand, Amenemope was written much before that time, when Israelite influence upon Egypt was well nigh impossible, then one would be forced to grant priority to Amenemope over Proverbs. The problem, as we saw in Chapter 3, was that no one yet knew when Amenemope had actually been written, and until they did, hypotheses such as Esterly's were as plausible as any other. The next salvo in the dispute was fired in 1929 by Herzog. He quoted Oesterle favorably but went even further, rejecting not only Ehrman's theory that Proverbs borrowed from Amenemope, but also Oesterle's postulation of a common document from which both had borrowed. Citing everyone from Goethe to Ibn Janya, Herzog maintained that none of the alleged parallels between Proverbs and Amenemope were compelling, and that all could be explained by recourse to the stock of proverbial sayings and motifs which were the common property of human culture. He also dismissed alleged Egyptian influence on the Book of Proverbs as insignificant, and certainly less than that of Mesopotamia, on the grounds that if Egyptian influence had been sufficiently strong to impact Proverbs, we should be able to detect it more strongly in many other books of the Hebrew Bible. And finally, we come to the controversial 1930 article by R.O. Kevin, which R.J. Williams later described as the fiercest attack on Ehrman's thesis. Kevin began by emphasizing the various complaints of the early commentators about Amenemope's odd orthography and vocabulary, the corruption of the text, and the difficulty of trying to wring meaning out of what seemed an extraordinarily difficult and obtuse document. He went on to quote Oesterle to the effect that not only were Amenemope's religious sentiments and ethical concerns unique among Egyptian literature, but that in fact one may assert without fear of contradiction that the like is not to be found elsewhere in the ancient literature of pre-Christian times, with the one exception of the Hebrew scriptures. He then adopted Lang's extremely late dating of both Papyrus 10,474 and the writing of Amenemope itself, thereby bringing the date of composition down to 300 BC. Finally, he adopted a pre-exilic date for the composition of Proverbs, thereby creating a scenario which, as he himself put it, exactly reverses the situation from what it was before. Now, it seemed, Proverbs could not possibly have borrowed from Amenemope, but Amenemope could certainly have borrowed from Proverbs. To support this novel interpretation, Kevin adduced 38 alleged Semitisms in the vocabulary and phrasing of Amenemope, after which he gave his own analysis of the parallels between Amenemope and Proverbs. The latter exercise purported to demonstrate that the obscurities of the Egyptian text were best explained as the work of an inept Egyptian translator who had only a tenuous grasp of the subtleties of the Hebrew text, which was allegedly before him. Kevin concluded that in Amenemope, we have a work that departs from the standard type of Egyptian wisdom literature for the good reason that its author found in another work of Hebrew origin a moral and religious teaching that he wanted to commend to his fellow countrymen. Amenemope was profoundly influenced by the Hebrew scriptures, and his work was directly called into being when a copy of a little book of 30 Hebrew proverbs, the words of the wise, fell into his hands. Kevin's article may indeed have been intended as a serious assault on Ehrman's theory, but in fact it had very little impact. Within the community of professional Egyptologists, it was simply dismissed out of hand. As Williams put it, Kevin's thesis did not meet with acceptance, since his superficial knowledge of Egyptian rendered his arguments valueless. Even those outside of Egyptology gave it short shrift. The eminent German theologian Johann Fichtner relegated Kevin to a footnote, wherein it was concluded that his premises were questionable and his arguments inadequate. R.H. Pfeiffer's commentary on the Old Testament similarly dismissed him, also in a footnote, with the comment that his efforts can hardly be called successful. Herzog's arguments, too, were largely dismissed, not for a lack of rigor or scholarly breadth, but for failing to discern a forest amidst all the trees. His primary complaint, in essence, was that one can almost always find some sort of parallel somewhere to any given proverb, simply because of the universality of human concerns and conditions. Hence, in his view, the alleged parallels between Amenemope and Proverbs are insufficient to demonstrate any sort of relationship between the two documents. But as Brunet pointed out some years later, while Herzog's contention may be true when individual proverbs are compared in isolation, the same cannot be said for collections of proverbs which exhibit a similar selection of material and some measure of common structure, as do Amenemope and the sayings of the wise in the book of Proverbs. In short, Herzog's arguments prove too much, and hence prove nothing at all. As for Oesterle, the one who had started it all with his 1927 article and book, his position was soundly refuted 2 years later by Humbert, who derided Oesterle's arguments as specious, and his postulation of a common source as gratuitous and superfluous. Humbert pointed out first of all that Amenemope was not, in fact, all that unique in Egyptian literature, and that similar religious sentiments and ethical admonitions could be found in the other instructions, in the Ramesside hymns, in the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, and even in the negative confession of the Book of the Dead. Furthermore, he added, both the form and the content of Amenemope lay within the boundaries of the traditional Egyptian instructional genre, and its social and religious references were thoroughly Egyptian. In sum, he said, it is far easier to explain the parallel texts in Proverbs as extracts from Amenemope than it is to explain Amenemope as an expansion of the parallel texts in Proverbs. Therefore, it is Amenemope which is the direct source of Proverbs 22:17, 23:1, 11, rather than vice versa. In fact, Oesterle himself had apparently come to the same conclusions on his own, His 1929 commentary on the book of Proverbs mentioned in passing the quite obvious parallels between Amenemope and Proverbs, and then added that, for a variety of reasons, we are forced to the conclusion that the Hebrew sage has made copious use of the Egyptian wisdom book.
Excursus, the plausibility of borrowing.
And so it was that the professional Egyptologists successfully repelled the first counterattack mounted against the Erman consensus by outsiders. The attackers did, however, raise at least one important question. Early Judaism, which was presumed to be a direct continuation of the religion of ancient Israel, was famous for its unyielding hostility toward any form of syncretism, or any accommodation whatever, with paganism. Indeed, it was said to have rejected the religion of Saul of Tarsus and his Gentile Messiah on precisely those grounds. Just how plausible was it, then, that an ancient Yahwist would have knowingly incorporated portions of a pagan didactic text into his people's most sacred literature? And if in fact there had been such borrowings from pagan sources, why did they seem to be so limited in scope and so hard to nail down upon investigation? On its face, of course, the presence of foreign influences in the culture and even the religion of ancient Israel seems not only unobjectionable, but even inevitable. Sitting as it did astride the only land corridor between Egypt and Asia, ancient Israel was inevitably a crossroads of civilizations, and hence subjected not only to the repeated incursions of foreign armies, but also to the continuous infiltration of foreign beliefs and practices. As the Hebrew Bible itself makes clear, anyone seeking to insulate Israelite religion and culture from foreign influences was faced with a task which was not only Herculean, but positively Sisyphean. Given the geography of the situation, significant outside influences might be expected to come from at least three sources. Two of these were the great centers of power in the ancient Near East, Egypt and Mesopotamia, which lay on either side of Israel like the jaws of a vice. Both were home to high civilizations of great antiquity, whose art, architecture, social and political institutions, literature and religion had tremendous influence on everyone around them, and they might well be expected to have had a significant impact upon Israel as well. A third possible source of alien influence was the indigenous population, which had preceded the Israelites as the masters of the land of Canaan. In the Hebrew Bible, these groups are variously enumerated as Amalekites, Amorites, Anakim, Archites, Arvadites, Girgashites, Hamathites, Hittites, Hivites, Jebusites, Cadmonites, Kenites, Kenizzites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Sidonians, Sinites. Given that these Canaanites were already in the land at the time of the Israelite ascendancy, and that they continued to live side by side with the Israelites for centuries afterward, one might certainly expect them to have exercised significant influence upon their Israelite neighbors. But before the archaeological discoveries of the modern era, virtually all the available information about the religion of ancient Israel, and much of the data about the religions of its neighbors as well, was contained in the Hebrew Bible, and that information was almost universally interpreted through the lens of post-biblical Jewish and Christian traditions. Those traditions generally assumed that any foreign influence upon the religion of Israel was self-evidently contrary to the revealed will of God, and had therefore been systematically rooted out of Israelite religion in general, and the Hebrew scriptures in particular. After all, Egypt was the house of slavery, an iron smelting furnace from which the children of Israel were able to escape only with divine assistance. And Mesopotamia was the home of the Assyrians and Babylonians, power-hungry invaders who ravaged Israel's cities, destroyed its holy places, and murdered or exiled its population. Both Egypt and Mesopotamia were fervently and resoundingly condemned in the later texts of the Hebrew Bible, especially the prophecies and polemics of the Hebrew prophets, who repeatedly castigated their neighbors' cruel folly and ridiculed their idolatrous religions. What possible good could come from peoples and places such as these? This is what you shall do to them. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles, burn their idols with fire. But in fact, we are told, the Israelites did not follow these instructions, but allowed the Canaanites to live among them and even intermarried with them. And, as predicted, the Israelites were indeed drawn away after other gods. Thus began a spiritual tug-of-war between Yahweh and the gods of Canaan, which culminated in the destruction of the greater part of the nation and the exile of the remainder to Babylon, until they finally learned to worship Yahweh alone. After the cleansing experience of exile, the remnant of Israel had returned wholeheartedly to Yahweh. Its religion had been purified, and the spirit of idolatry had finally been quenched. Surprisingly, however, so had the spirit of prophecy, which meant that the canon of inspired scripture was now closed. Henceforth, the tenets of the one true religion were to be found not in the mouths of living prophets, but in the words of a finished book, directly inspired or even dictated by God himself, mostly in the Hebrew language and faithfully recorded for all time in Assyrian script. In fact, Jewish tradition even maintained that the exact provenance of each of its sacred writings was known, and all could confidently be attributed to great figures from Israel's past. Moses wrote his own book and Job. Joshua wrote the book that bears his name and the last 8 verses of the 5 books. Samuel wrote the book that bears his name, as well as Judges and Ruth. David wrote the book of Psalms, including in it the work of 10 elders. Jeremiah wrote the book that bears his name, the book of Kings and Lamentations. Hezekiah and his colleagues published Isaiah, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastics. The men of the Great Assembly published Ezekiel and the 12, Daniel and the Scroll of Esther. Ezra wrote the book that bear his own name, Ezra Nehemiah, and the genealogies in the book of Chronicles up to his own time. Thus, all the books of the Hebrew Scriptures received an official pedigree. Most were pre-exilic, none were significantly later than Ezra, and all were promulgated on the authority of someone of unquestionable orthodoxy and good judgment. And so, ultimately, all had been set right. Yes, there had been prolonged and lamentable lapses throughout Israel's history, when popular folly or the wickedness of kings had led the nation astray. Yes, they had gone whoring after the gods of the nations, worshipping Asherah and Baal and Molech. Yes, they had broken their covenant with Yahweh time and again, reaping oppression and exile as a result. But in the end, Israel had abandoned its idolatry and returned to the pure worship of Yahweh as they had been taught by Moses and the prophets, and the religion of Israel had been purged forever of all foreign taint. To a surprising extent, this foundation myth passed unchallenged from Judaism into Christianity, where it still prospers to this day, and thereby into the traditions of Western scholarship. Within such an interpretive framework, entertaining even the possibility of foreign influence in the biblical text seemed tantamount to sacrilege, and any suggestion that the pure religion of patriarchs and prophets might owe anything positive to Egyptian or Mesopotamian or Canaanite sources seemed absurd on its face. Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the creator of the universe. What possible use could he have for the gibberings of idol worshippers? While it might be admitted that the Israelites could have picked up technical expertise and ideologically neutral cultural practices from their pagan neighbors, it seemed unlikely to the point of impossibility that Orthodox Yahwists might also have adopted any of their neighbors' religious or ethical ideas, or incorporated elements of foreign literatures into their sacred writings. As a result, for at least the first 15 centuries of the Christian era, foreign influence in the Hebrew Scriptures was a null concept, if not an outright contradiction in terms. But in point of fact, even before the spades of the archaeologists began to recover the art, the architecture, the history, and most importantly, the literatures of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and a bit later, Ugarit, there were reasons to believe that the truth about Israel's religion was considerably more complicated than anyone wanted to admit, and that the ostensibly pure and monolithic Judaism of the post-exilic era was more myth than reality. For example, there was a striking contrast between the inward-looking, some would say even xenophobic, Judaism, which emerged in Palestine as a result of the Seleucid oppression and the subsequent fratricide of the Hasmonean era, and the more generous and cosmopolitan Judaism, which grew up in Alexandria under the comparatively benevolent rule of the Ptolemies. In fact, a close examination of the surviving records suggests to some that even the Maccabean revolt was not just a struggle between Orthodox Jews on one side and Hellenized apostates on the other, but a contest between multiple factions, each with its own rival vision of real Judaism. As Fisher aptly put it, we cannot claim that there was a canonical unity of the Judean nation and its Torah for the years of the protracted crisis. Rather, we encounter different entities, languages, concepts, traditions, intentions, target groups, varying and increasingly differentiated segments and apologetically or polemically reacting identities and individuals. Both openly and in more covert form, intercultural connections become evident. While Fisher was speaking specifically about the Maccabean era, the same could in truth be said about virtually every other era of Israelite history from beginning to end. Once we know to look for it, the evidence of a more cosmopolitan attitude can be found within the Bible itself. Its creation story emphasized the descent of the entire human race from one original couple, and hence the universal brotherhood of all human beings. The story of the flood implied the destruction of all flesh except for one family, through whom the entire world was repopulated, and the ethical norms given to that family by the Creator were considered binding upon the whole human race. Abram, the ancestor of the chosen people, not only came from pagan Mesopotamia, but maintained close relations with his kindred there and married his son to one of them. Ultimately, he became the ancestor not only of the nation of Israel, but also of Edom and the many nations of the eastern deserts. Returning from a successful military expedition to rescue his kidnapped nephew Lot, Abraham encountered Melchizedek, the priest king of pagan Salem, later identified with Jerusalem, who brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Abraham's great-grandson Joseph, sold into slavery in Egypt, became the vizier of Pharaoh, accepted an Egyptian name, married the daughter of a priest of Ra at Heliopolis, saved the Egyptians from starvation during 7 years of famine, and had the body of his father Jacob mummified and buried according to Egyptian funerary procedures. Generations later, Moses the Hebrew became Moses the Egyptian, who was raised in the household of Pharaoh and educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, so that he became powerful in speech and action. Fleeing into exile in Arabia, he married the daughter of a priest of Midian, and later Moses and his Midianite father-in-law shared a sacrificial meal along with all the elders of Israel. When the children of Israel left Egypt in the Exodus, a mixed multitude of non-Israelites came out with them, and at least some of these were apparently grafted into Israel under the Sinai covenant on the same terms as those who were born to it, as others certainly were later. And the law which Moses gave to Israel warned them, "Do not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. Do not abhor an Egyptian, because you lived as an alien in his country. The third generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord." Once Israel was settled in the land of Canaan and a kingdom had been established, King David conquered the old pagan city of Jerusalem, but failed to put it to the sword as the law required. Instead, he made it his capital, and apparently retained the old regime's civil administration, including a number of officers whose names and titles are suspiciously Egyptian-sounding. At a moment of crisis, David bought the Temple Mount from Araunah the Jebusite, who was apparently the last priest-king of the old order at Jerusalem. David then immediately performed a sacrifice, even though he was descended from the tribe of Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. Thereby he became, quite independently of his position as king of Israel and Judah, the priest-king of Jerusalem, and therefore a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Solomon, his son and successor, made an alliance with Pharaoh early in his reign and even married an Egyptian princess. Then he began building a temple of Yahweh on the site which his father had purchased. Solomon contracted the labor and expertise for the temple and its furnishings from Hiram, the pagan king of Tyre, whose people apparently had considerable experience in such matters. Even after Solomon's kingdom was divided, apparently with Egyptian connivance, into the two separate and often warring states, and despite the subsequent pillaging of both Israel and Judah by the Egyptian army under Pharaoh Sheshonq in later times, there always seemed to be an Egyptian party at the court, either bending the king's ear or waiting for the opportunity to do so. This severely distressed the later prophets, who were repeatedly provoked to remind the nation and its leaders that they should place their trust in Yahweh, not in Egyptian military power. "Woe to the obstinate children," declares Yahweh, "to those who carry out plans that are not mine, forming an alliance but not by my spirit, who go down to Egypt without consulting me, who look for help to Pharaoh's protection, to Egypt's shade for refuge. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots and the great strength of their horsemen, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel. The Egyptians are men and not gods. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. Egypt might once have been the home of wisdom, the prophet said, but the once great wise men of Egypt were wise no longer. The officials of Tanis are nothing but fools. The wise counselors of Pharaoh give senseless advice. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am one of the wise men, a disciple of the ancient kings? Where are your wise men now? Let them show you and make known what Yahweh of hosts has planned against Egypt. The officials of Tanis have become fools. The leaders of Memphis are deceived. The cornerstones of her peoples have led Egypt astray. Yahweh has poured into them a spirit of dizziness. They make Egypt stagger in all that she does. But the prophets were not entirely hostile to the surrounding nations, especially Egypt. The Egyptians would be chastened for their hubris and their idolatry, but the day of their redemption would eventually come. In that day, 5 cities in Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to Yahweh of hosts. One of them will be Heliopolis. In that day, there will be an altar to Yahweh in the heart of Egypt, and a monument to Yahweh at its border. In that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrians will travel into Egypt, and the Egyptians into Assyria. And the Egyptians will worship together with the Assyrians. In that day, Israel will be a third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, which Yahweh of hosts shall have blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel my inheritance. In fact, the message of Yahweh as conveyed to and through his prophets was often far more generous toward Israel's neighbors and far less supportive of Israel's own uniqueness than the Israelites themselves wanted to hear. Yes, Yahweh had chosen them from among all the other peoples, not for their greatness, but because they were nothing. Yes, Yahweh had brought them up out of Egypt, just as he had brought up the Philistines from Caphtor and the Arameans from Kir. Yes, he had driven out the Canaanites before them, not because of Israel's righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked people, but because of the Canaanites' own wickedness, and in order to fulfill his promises, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yes, he had caused his name to dwell in Jerusalem, just as he had once caused it to dwell at Shiloh, which was now a heap of ruins because of Israel's sins. The prophet Amos summed it up in a line which must have cut the Israelites to the heart. Are not you Israelites the same to me as the Nubians? And on the other side of the equation, there were the numerous unexpected gestures of forbearance by Yahweh toward the Gentiles, both individually and collectively. When Naaman the Syrian was healed of leprosy by the prophet Elisha, he became a devoted Yahwist, but also asked, and was given leave, to continue to attend his master in the temple of the Syrian god Rimmon. When the prophet Jonah complained that Yahweh had not destroyed the pagan Ninevites as they deserved, he was told, Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about that great city? And the prophet Malachi contrasted the worship of Israel with the worship of the Gentiles in surprising terms. I am not pleased with you, says Yahweh of hosts, and I will accept no offering from your hand. Indeed, from the rising of the sun to its setting, great is my name among the nations, and in every place incense and pure offerings are brought to my name, says Yahweh of hosts, but you profane it. And then there was Yahweh's inexplicable coziness with certain pagan kings. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon who destroyed Jerusalem and carried off its population into exile, was called my servant. Cyrus, the king of Persia, who returned the exiles to Jerusalem and rebuilt its temple, was even called my anointed. Oddest of all is the story of Pharaoh Necho and his dealings with Josiah, the righteous king of Judah. Josiah had renewed the covenant, restored the observance of the law of Moses, desecrated the old high places, and suppressed all the mediums and spiritists, the household gods, the idols, and all the other detestable things seen in Judah and Jerusalem. Of him it was said that neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him who turned to Yahweh as he did, with all his heart, and with all his soul, and with all his strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. And yet after all that we read, Necho king of Egypt went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah marched out to meet him in battle. But Necho sent messengers to him, saying, What is there between you and me, king of Judah? My fight is not with you this day. but with another, and God has told me to hurry. Stop opposing God who is with me, lest he destroy you." Josiah, however, would not turn away from him, but disguised himself to engage him in battle. He would not listen to what Necho had said at God's command, but went to fight him on the plain of Megiddo. And so righteous King Josiah died, and his Judean Renaissance died with him, all because he refused to listen to what Necho had said at God's command. But of course, Necho was not a Yahwist. Necho was an Egyptian pharaoh, undoubtedly devoted to the traditional gods of Egypt, as his titulary and inscriptions show. Clearly something is going on here that cannot easily be explained within traditional category. But of course, the operative word here is easily. It was not absolutely impossible to explain away the indications of a more cosmopolitan spirit even within Orthodox Israelite religion. The human mind, after all, is capable of inventing explanations for almost anything, and many such were proposed. The universal brotherhood of man was vitiated by the universality of sin, which had so utterly corrupted everything human that there was nothing good left in anyone except for a tiny group of God's chosen, or, alternatively, everyone who is not just like us is really descended from Cain or Ham or someone else we don't like, and therefore accursed. The covenant with Noah was superseded by those with Abraham, Moses, and David, and therefore is no longer in effect. Abraham may have come from pagan stock, but he had also been called out from among them and told never to return. The fact that both Isaac and Jacob took brides from the old country is explained simply by grafting all those distant kinsmen into the household of Yahweh, whether they like it or not. Abraham's submission to the priest-king Melchizedek is rendered harmless by making Melchizedek an angel, or maybe even God himself, in human form. Joseph's adherence to Egyptian customs is dismissed as a necessary submission to meaningless cultural conventions. And his marriage to the daughter of a pagan priest was, of course, preceded by her conversion to Yahwism. On the other hand, Solomon's commission of exactly the same offense was the proximate cause of his fall from grace and subsequent descent into an embittered apostasy, as evidenced by that product of his old age, the book of Ecclesiastes. The prophet's invidious comparison of Israel to the Gentiles only showed how disgusted God was with Israel, not how much he cared for the nations. And since his statements about Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, were as yet unfulfilled prophecy, they no doubt merely envisioned those nations' future conversion to the one true religion. And as for the unhappy fate of righteous King Josiah, who died because he failed to heed the words spoken by God through the mouth of an Egyptian pharaoh, well, we just aren't going to go there. All neat and tidy, if a bit ad hoc on occasion. But then came the archaeologists, and everything changed.
The Archaeological Revolution.
Once archaeologists began recovering and deciphering the original records of the ancient kingdoms of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Ugarit, along with their arts and crafts, their secular and religious architecture, their tombs, and even the detritus of their everyday lives, it quickly became apparent that the traditional understanding of Israelite religion was, to say the least, inadequate. Biblical writings, which once stood in glorious isolation, were now discovered to have close analogues among Israel's ancient neighbors. Vocabulary, motifs, and even bits of theology, which were once thought to be the unique possession of the chosen people, were now discovered to be the common coinage of the entire ancient Near East. To some, of course, this presented yet another opportunity to prove the Bible. To others, however, the new discoveries required nothing less than a revolutionary re-evaluation of our understanding of the Bible itself, and of the culture from which the sacred texts had emerged. Even now, as we enter the 21st century, many important issues remain unresolved pending further discoveries. On the one hand, the earlier scholarship's assured results have, in many cases, turned out to be partly mistaken or even wholly imaginary, although their destructive impact on the traditional biblical faiths was all too real. On the other hand, what began as a necessary re-evaluation has in some quarters turned into wanton and wholesale deconstruction, with minimalist scholars gleefully hammering away at the foundations of everything biblical. Somewhere in between, however, lies a body of results which in fact are more or less assured, and with which the serious student of the Bible must come to grips. Rather than comment extensively on the innumerable points of contact between the text of the Hebrew Bible and the cultures of the ancient Near East, A&E, we must for the most part be content with a simple and far from exhaustive enumeration. The first two verses of Genesis exhibit a structure virtually identical to the opening lines of numerous other A&E creation stories, which suggests that they belong to the same cosmopolitan genre. Numerous aspects of the Genesis creation narrative have their counterparts in other A&E creation stories, both Egyptian and Mesopotamian. The beginning of creation with formless chaos. The sequencing of creation by a series of distinct divine acts involving the separation of one element from another. The implementation of creation by the spoken word of the Creator, and the resting of the Creator after his labors. Many of the central motifs in the biblical story of mankind's creation and fall, Genesis 2-3, creation out of the ground, a sacred tree, forbidden food, a serpent, a deception or attack by divine beings, and the awakening of sexuality, can be found often clustered together in other A&E texts, including the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Tale of Adapa. The lists of antediluvian patriarchs in Genesis 4:5 clearly have some kind of connection with the similar lists of kings and sages in ancient Mesopotamia, although the exact relationship is still disputed. This connection seems particularly strong in the case of Enoch, who appears to have been patterned after the antediluvian patriarch Enmeduranki in the pagan traditions of Mesopotamia. The biblical account of Noah's Ark and the flood, Genesis 6, verses 8, is extremely close to the deluge stories in the Epic of Gilgamesh and, to a lesser extent, the Epic of Atrahasis, not only in the broad outlines of the story, but even in minute details. The story of the confounding of human languages in Genesis has a close parallel in an ancient Sumerian text. The patriarchs did not worship God under the name of Yahweh, but under several different variants of the ancient Semitic deity name El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Roy, El Olam, El Elohe Israel, and El Bethel. Some of these same names with the same associated attributes are known to have been applied to the high god of the Canaanites. The patriarchal practice of setting up standing stones to commemorate an encounter with God or to mark a sacred site is virtually indistinguishable from the practices of the Midianites and other ancient desert dwellers. The movable tabernacle and the bronze serpent Nehushtan, both of which were manufactured by Moses for use in the cult of Yahweh, were also part of the religion of the ancient Midianites, among whom, as we have already mentioned above, Moses stayed for 40 years, and with whom he worshipped and intermarried. A similar tabernacle was also a trademark of the worship of the ancient Semitic god El, both in Canaan and at Ugarit. Many provisions of the Mosaic Covenant Code, Exodus 20:21, 23:19, are closely paralleled in various pre-Israelite Mesopotamian and Hittite law codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi. Several of the annual festivals which are commanded in the Pentateuch, most notably Passover, Pentecost, and Sukkoth, have their roots in Canaanite agricultural festivals. The scapegoat ritual of the Day of Atonement in Leviticus has a very close analog in Hittite ritual. In fact, there are quite a number of points of contact, sometimes very detailed, between the priestly materials in Leviticus and Numbers and the corresponding regulations of Hittite religious practices. There are striking similarities between the red heifer ceremonies of Numbers 19:01-22 and the Egyptian sacrifice of red oxen. These will be discussed in detail in Section 2. The boundaries of the land which Yahweh gave to Israel in the book of Numbers correspond exactly to the boundaries of the Egyptian province of Canaan in the time of Ramesses II and his successors. The structure of the Deuteronomic covenant between Yahweh and Israel conforms with great precision to the structure of pre-Israelite covenants between the kings of the Hittites and their vassals. The biblical idea that God uses historical events and natural disasters to reward the faithful and punish the disobedient was held in common by virtually the entire A&E. So was the notion that the wars of men on the ground reflect conflicts between the gods of the respective parties. In addition, holy war was practiced by Israel's pagan neighbors on almost exactly the same terms as it was by Israel itself, including the imposition of the MRX quorum, Herim equals ban, under whose terms Entire cities with their inhabitants were devoted to one's patron deity for utter destruction. The divine kingship which Yahweh exercised over Israel and Judah was functionally almost identical to the divine kingship which Amun-Ra exercised in the later history of Egypt, and the role played in Jerusalem by the Davidic king, who was styled as the son of Yahweh, was surprisingly similar to the role played in Egypt by Pharaoh, who was styled as the son of Ra. These correspondences extended not only to the king's position as supreme warlord, enforcer of justice, protector of the dispossessed, etc., but also to his duties as chief priest of the nation, and even to the details of the coronation ritual and the king's titulary. The architectural layout, iconography, and furnishings of Solomon's temple as described in the Bible are strikingly similar to those of the pagan temples in Canaan, Syria, and Phoenicia. Solomon's temple also bears a strong resemblance to the standardized Egyptian cult temples of the New Kingdom, most notably in its tripartite longitudinal design, with the Holy of Holies at the back, where the Ark of the Covenant, corresponding to the Egyptian Naos, resided in perpetual darkness, and only the high priest was allowed to enter. The book of Job is chock full of Canaanite deity names, astrological references, and other mythological elements which have been only superficially demythologized. In fact, at one point the book apparently depicts Yahweh himself as referring without hostility or objection to the real existence of Egyptian deities when he asks Job, "Who put wisdom in Thoth, or gave understanding to Sekwi?" The Song of Songs exhibits striking similarities to the Egyptian love songs of the Ramesside era, and it is almost certainly either based directly on Egyptian models or, more likely, on Phoenician/Canaanite traditions which ultimately originated in Egypt. The prophet Malachi uses the strikingly Egyptian image of the winged sun in his description of the day of Yahweh. "But for you who revere my name, the Sun of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings." At least one of the biblical psalms, Psalm 104, is known to have originated in the solar hymnody of the Egyptian New Kingdom, probably by way of either the Phoenicians or the Canaanites. Another, Psalm 29, is known to have originated in the storm god imagery of pagan Phoenicia. Many other psalms also show significant points of contact with pagan sources. In fact, biblical poetry in general, of which the Book of Psalms is of course the prime example, is directly modeled upon the earlier Canaanite poetry, not in just a few particulars, but throughout the entire range of the literary language, and in all the rhetorical techniques employed therein. Biblical literature is but the continuation of the ancient Canaanite literature. Among the motifs appropriated from Canaanite literature are those of Yahweh's conflict with the sea, his conquest of the dragons Rahab and Leviathan, and his lordship over the monster Behemoth. There are a number of references to these in the Psalms, Job, and the Prophets, and collectively they have obvious connections with the Baal cycle as found at Ugarit. As if all this were not enough, it turns out that even the alleged purity of Israelite monotheism is rendered suspect by a close reading of the Hebrew Bible and its comparison with the literature recovered from Ugarit. The stringently monotheistic Talmud cites a number of apparently non-monotheistic passages from the Hebrew Bible, including Genesis 1:26, "Let us make man in our image," and Genesis 11:7, "Let us go down and confound their language," which it explains as referring to the court of heaven, often referred to in modern scholarship as the divine council. The Holy One, blessed be He, does nothing without consulting His heavenly court, for it is written, "The matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones." These watchers and holy ones are referred to by a number of different names in the Hebrew Bible, including the morning stars and the host of heaven, but the most common term for them is simply the sons of God, the sons of the Most High, or even just gods. Despite the efforts of later editors and interpreters to demote them to the ranks of mere angels, they are in essence divine beings. They are present at the creation of the world, they constitute the first rank of the divine council, 212, and they are entrusted with the rule of the nations. All of them, that is, except for Israel. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when He divided all mankind, He set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. but Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. Israel then, as Yahweh's portion and inheritance, is bound to worship him alone. The rest of the world, however, is governed by Yahweh mediately through his sons, and the peoples of the nations are therefore free to worship those members of the host of heaven who have been allotted to them. Unfortunately, the sons of God, who were entrusted with responsibility for administering the world, apparently did a rather poor job of it. They often fight among themselves, to the great detriment of the human beings entrusted to their care, and in the end, Yahweh indicts them for corruption and incompetence, and sentences them to death. One of them, Hillel ben Shahar equals Shining One, son of Dawn, is even accused of attempting to seize Yahweh's own place as head of the council, although of course such pretensions were inevitably doomed to failure. This conciliary structure of the world's government, with what can only be called subordinate divinities ruling as viceroys of the Creator, has an extraordinary parallel in the religion of ancient Ugarit. There too, the world is ruled by a high god named El, who presides over a council of lesser gods, referred to as his sons. There too, corruption and incompetence run rampant, and there is fierce fighting among the competing divine powers. And there too, El's position is coveted by one of his sons, a subordinate deity named Baal. In the case of Ugarit, however, Baal's usurpation of El's authority seems to have been more or less successful. Here then, we have not only an incredibly close parallel between pre-Israelite paganism and the implicit theology of the biblical text, but also a cogent explanation for the endless conflict in the Hebrew Bible between Yahweh and Baal. El, we are told on good authority, is none other than Yahweh. And Baal, in the religion of Ugarit as well as the religion of Israel, is the one who seeks to usurp El's place, something which no faithful Yahwist could possibly tolerate. In sum, the archaeological discoveries of the past 2 centuries have forced a wholesale reevaluation of the traditional understanding of Israelite religion as it is portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, and that reevaluation has established beyond a reasonable doubt that even in its official and most orthodox form, Yahwism was far more open to influences from its predecessors and its neighbors than anyone had heretofore considered possible. Note especially that the things we have in view here are not the unofficial or heterodox practices which the Hebrew Bible condemns, such as divination, witchcraft, idolatry, cults of the dead, the worship of foreign deities, worship of the goddess Asherah as Yahweh's consort, or the continuation of sacrifices at the high places after the official consolidation of the cult at Jerusalem. On the contrary, what we are dealing with is the official theory and praxis of Orthodox Yahwism as promulgated by its own authoritative documents, the accounts of creation, the primeval history, the illustrious deeds of the patriarchs, the practice of the official cult by Moses and David, the design and furnishings of Solomon's temple, where Yahweh caused his name to dwell, the canonical psalms, and the inspired words of the prophets. If this is all to be dismissed as it has been by some, as nothing but pagan polytheists, a more subtle approach would seem to be required. This is not to deny that there was something unique about the faith of Israel. Given its later impact upon the history of the world, there must indeed have been something special about it. But what the above analysis clearly demonstrates is that the special character of Yahwism did not lie in the raw material it had to work with, which was much the same throughout the ancient Near East, but rather in the way that material was reshaped by Yahwism's unique spiritual genius. Exactly what that genius might have been is beyond the scope of our present investigation, and all this without ever going near the book of Proverbs. But given what we now know, the prospect that an editor of that book might have borrowed a few harmless sayings from an Egyptian sage suddenly seems like a very small thing indeed.
Into the maelstrom, the 30s and 40s.
With the issue of plausibility out of the way, it is time to return to the main thread of our narrative. As the world moved deeper into the Great Depression and toward World War II, the abstract academic issues which had so exercised the great scholars of Europe began to recede into the background, including the once burgeoning research on wisdom literature in general and Amenemope in particular. In 1931, Pete published his Schweik Lectures of 2 years before, describing Amenemope as a late composition hardly earlier than the beginning of the first millennium BC, He lauded it as a document which brings the two literatures nearer together in time and indicates the period at which Egyptian wisdom may have made its chief impression on the Hebrews. The width of its scope, its high moral tone, and its poetical form all bring it nearer to Hebrew literature than perhaps any other document which has survived from ancient Egypt. In 1932, there was a short article by Fleming James discussing the roles and attitudes of the wise men in Israel. The next year, Rudolf Anthus published a monograph on rules of conduct and practical wisdom in the Egyptian instructions, including Amenemope. That same year also saw the publication of J.H. Breasted's monumental synthesis, The Dawn of Conscience, in which he focused on the development of religious sentiment and ethical awareness across the span of Egyptian history. Breasted devoted many pages to Amenemope, summarizing its teaching and comparing it with Proverbs and other biblical texts. He was wholly devoted to the Erman consensus, including a date of composition in the 10th century BC. "We now know," he wrote, "that the wisdom of Amenemope was translated into Hebrew, it was read by Hebrews, and an important part of it found its way into the Old Testament, a fact which was recognized by all Old Testament scholars of any weight or standing." He also considered it obvious that Amenemope had influenced the biblical authors of the Pentateuch, Job, Samuel, and Jeremiah. In 1934, Samuel Mercer published 2 articles summarizing the state of the scholarship on Amenemope to date. He endorsed Lang's views on the late date of the original composition, provided a new English translation, which was, however, heavily indebted to Griffith, showed some sympathy for Kevin's assertion of the priority of Proverbs, and especially emphasized that in Amenemope we are faced with the highest system of morality to be found in any ancient Egyptian writing, which was all the more striking because it is founded on a deep sense of religious values. However, he made short work of the notion that Amenemope represents some sort of Egyptian monotheism, citing 18 instances of characteristically polytheistic expressions which can be paralleled in other examples of Egyptian literature. That same year, Emile Suisse, who was already in the process of completing a massive handwritten tome on the Instruction of Amenemope, published a long essay on the theology of Amenemope. After surveying Amenemope's similarities to Tahotep, Mereker, Ani, the Laden hymns, and various other Egyptian texts, he concluded, as did Mercer and others before him, that while Amenemope certainly provides evidence for the movement of Egyptian thought toward a more transcendent idea of deity and a more elevated sense of morality, it clearly does not espouse anything that could reasonably be called monotheism. In 1935, Wolfgang Spiegel published an in-depth analysis of Amenemope's Prologue, i.e. the first 45 lines. 2 years later, B. Gimser's Handbook on the Book of Proverbs was published in German. The section on the words of the wise endorsed Ehrman's list of borrowings from Amenemope, but Gimser also emphasized that these had not been slavishly copied by the biblical author, but carefully adapted to the needs of his own audience. The next year, in 1938, A.M. Blackman published a short philological article on the use of the Egyptian word titi equals house to represent chapter divisions, and the possible survival of that usage into modern languages. That same year, James McGlinchey completed the first American doctoral dissertation on Amenemope, a much abridged version of which was published a year later. McGlinchey was clearly, and by his own admission, reacting to the extravagant claims made by Breasted and others for Amenemope's influence upon the Hebrew Bible. Accordingly, McGlinchey conducted his own detailed comparison of Amenemope with the Book of Proverbs, not only the words of the wise in Proverbs 22:24, but also the rest of the book as well, and also with a number of other biblical texts. While he agreed that there were indeed many similarities of thought and expression between Amenemope and the Book of Proverbs, although little, if any, direct borrowing, he also noted that the same kinds of resonances could be found in other biblical books, which are known to be considerably older than Proverbs. Since it seemed unlikely to him that a single Egyptian work could have influenced all these disparate biblical texts, it seemed more reasonable to him that the influence has been from Israel to Egypt. Given the sophistication of his analysis and the prestige of his publisher, McGlinchey's dissertation might have been expected to set off another round of debate among Egyptologists and biblicists about the relationship between Amenemope and Proverbs. But his work was published in the same year that Hitler invaded Poland, and the world had other things on its mind. Then came the maelstrom, and Amenemope was all but forgotten for the next 10 years.
The Bible and ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature.
When the curtain went up again, the war was over, but the previous wave of wisdom research had spent itself, and once more it seemed that there was little left to be said. It was now widely accepted that both the Israelite and the Egyptian wisdom literatures were in some fashion connected to each other, and also to the larger and rather cosmopolitan literary milieu of the ancient Near East as a whole, although the exact nature of that connection remained somewhat nebulous. The Ehrman consensus regarding the relationship between Amenemope and Proverbs still held the field, although occasionally there was at least a perfunctory challenge. For example, in 1948, École Brunet, whom we have already mentioned above in our discussion of Herzog, analyzed once again the parallels between Amenemope and the words of the wise in Proverbs 22:17 to 24:22. He concluded that while there was clearly a substantial parallelism between the two, the nature of the relationship was not so clear as to force an acceptance of direct borrowing from the Egyptian. In 1949 and 1950, B. Couroye published a pair of articles comparing specific motifs in Egyptian and Israelite wisdom literature, one of which quoted a few lines of Amenemope. The year 1950 also saw the publication of Pritchard's massive ancient Near Eastern texts relating to the Old Testament, which included a partial translation of Amenemope by John A. Wilson. And in 1951, an article by W. Baumgartner in Rowley's Old Testament and Modern Study mentioned in passing that the dependence of Proverbs 22 to 24 on Amenemope has now been generally accepted, and that any attempt to dispute it must reckon with Amenemope's place in the succession of Egyptian wisdom books, such as Ptahhotep and Merikeri. That same year, Georges Posener mentioned ever so briefly the existence of an unpublished ostracon of Amenemope at the Cairo Museum, a revelation he attributed to J. Cerny. Eventually, the existence, and especially the dating of this little ostracon, would do more to clear the air than all the arguments of the scholars. In the meantime, the landscape of wisdom studies was about to undergo another major upheaval. Not because of Cerny's ostracon, which hardly anyone seems to have noticed at the time, but rather because of a short article by Gerhard von Rad on the Joseph story. Von Rad proposed that the familiar tale of Joseph in Genesis 37:50 was neither straight history nor an entertaining fiction, but rather a didactic wisdom story, which leans heavily upon influences emanating from Egypt, not only with regard to its conception of an educational ideal, but also in its fundamental theological ideas. As justification for this position, von Rad adduced what he perceived as the common underlying ideology of the two works, the idea that man proposes, but God disposes. Amenemope 375 to 376, the virtues of discretion, modesty, self-control, and deliberation. And finally, an intrusive skepticism which is close to embittered resignation. Von Rad's essay once again poured new life into the study of wisdom literature. To this point, although there had been occasional attempts to expand the boundaries, most people in the field had assumed that they knew exactly which books of the Bible comprised the corpus of biblical wisdom literature. It had never occurred to anyone before that the Joseph story might also be wisdom literature, but it looked like von Rad had a good case, and it inspired others to go searching for other wisdom passages that might have been overlooked. Additional enthusiasm for new wisdom study was generated by the publication 2 years later of Wisdom in Israel and the Ancient Near East, a compendium of essays by many of the major players in biblical studies, including von Rad himself, who now proposed that God's interrogation of Job was ultimately based on an onomasticon, like those which had been found in ancient Egypt. Two of the articles included in this volume were of particular importance for the study of Amenemope. The first, by W. F. Albright, offered, as we saw in Chapter 3, strong reasons for situating the composition of Amenemope just prior to the transition between the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, .256. The other, by Albrecht Alt, discuss the literary analysis of Amenemope.
Excursus, what is wisdom literature?
The search, sparked by von Rad for additional wisdom texts in the Hebrew Bible and at the same time for a deeper understanding of the nature of wisdom literature itself, went on for many years. Von Rad himself stoked the fires further in 1962 with the first volume of his massive Old Testament theology, wherein he discussed Israelite wisdom under the three heads of practical wisdom, theological wisdom, and skepticism. This was followed in 1970 by his final word on the subject, Wisdom in Israel, which effectively set the agenda for the next generation of biblical wisdom research. The study of biblical wisdom literature, it seemed, was becoming a series of footnotes to von Rad's many initiatives, as scholars endlessly debated the alleged course of wisdom literature's evolutionary development, from pre-literate folk wisdom to a sophisticated wisdom literature, the alleged emergence of that literature from an age of enlightenment under Solomon, the place of Israelite wisdom literature within the international context of its day, the existence or not of scribal schools and their relation to the palace, the attitude of the sages to the temple cultists, the relationship between Israelite wisdom and Egyptian Mot, the relationship between Israelite wisdom and Israelite apocalyptic, and whether there was any connection between the alleged hypostasis of wisdom in Proverbs 8 and similar expressions elsewhere. Along the way, scholars proclaimed the discovery of wisdom passages in additional portions of the Pentateuch, Samuel and Kings, the Psalms, the Prophets, and the Book of Esther. As one author wryly observed, the question was no longer where wisdom was to be found, but where it had failed to appear. At the same time, similar developments were taking place with respect to the literatures of Mesopotamia, Ugarit, and Egypt. Eventually, this seemingly endless expansion of the range of wisdom literature led to complaints about exaggerated claims supported by dubious arguments and assumptions, and a definition so comprehensive that it becomes unusable. Some, noting that wisdom, terminology, first arose from the particular concerns of biblical studies, questioned the prudence of extending that field's parochial vocabulary to the literatures of such disparate cultures as Egypt and Mesopotamia. A few even suggested that the terminology had outlived its usefulness within biblical studies itself. Others, however, dismissed such concerns as overblown and asserted that, unless taken to extremes, the term wisdom literature is an appropriate label for a fairly cohesive genre. In any case, recent scholarship has certainly recognized the need for more careful distinctions when speaking about wisdom and wisdom literature, and there have, understandably, been demands for precise definitions which could be applied across all the cultures of the ancient Near East. Early attempts at such definitions, however, failed to meet with universal approval and tended to dissolve into glittering generalities. Thus, wisdom was defined as that sagacity and common sense which enables men to live a happy and a prosperous life, as an attitude of prudence and a knowledge of how to do in life, which aims at mastering the reality which encounters us and at showing how man should live, and as practical knowledge of the laws of life and of the world, based on experience. Such definitions are at best inadequate. In fact, it is doubtful whether anyone will ever arrive at a definition of wisdom or wisdom literature which can be applied with equal accuracy to all the cultures of the ancient Near East, if for no other reason than that we analyze the world according to different criteria than the ancients did, and hence our labels and categories don't line up with theirs. Practically speaking, however, wisdom terminology has become so deeply embedded in scholarly discussion of ancient Near Eastern literature that further resistance, justified or not, is probably futile. But if the terminology is not to be abandoned entirely, at the very least it needs to be refurbished by an approach which is not so bound up with the presuppositions and conclusions of earlier scholarship. One authority who has thought outside the box on this issue is Giorgio Bucciolati, a specialist in Mesopotamian literature. After dismissing the identification of wisdom with a specific intellectual or spiritual movement, a specific body of wisdom literature, or even a literary genre, he continues, wisdom should be viewed as an intellectual phenomenon in itself. It is the second-degree reflective function as it begins to emerge in human culture. It takes shape in a variety of realizations and institutions, from onomastics to literature, from religion to the school. It provides the mental categories for a conscious, abstract confrontation with reality, from common sense correlations to higher-level theory. On the arc of progressive differentiation, which characterizes the evolution of human culture, wisdom marks the first explicit attempt to gain some distance from one's own inner self, and to cast the particular in a universal mold, which can be described rationally and critically. It is at once epistemology, ethics, ontology, and lyrical introspection. Thus, it can be said that wisdom has an internal coherence of its own, but as a dimension or attitude, not as an institution. It is not amorphous, but also it is not organized along systematic lines. Similarly, R.N. Wybrey, writing from the perspective of biblical studies, observed that for the ancients, wisdom was simply a general term denoting superior intellectual ability, whether innate or acquired, an ability which can be applied to anything that comes along, including the everyday problems of those who possessed it. But if this intellectual phenomenon, born of superior intellect, was to survive and be effective in the world at large, it could not remain as one man's unique insight, or even as the personal possession of a cloistered few. It had to be handed down from father to son, teacher to student, master to apprentice, i.e., it had to become a tradition, and after a time, in order to avoid being corrupted or forgotten, this tradition would almost inevitably have been committed to writing for the benefit of future generations and a wider audience, i.e., it was embodied in a literature, i.e., in the course of a long period in Israel's history, and we might add, also in the history of Egypt, there existed an educated class, albeit a small one, of well-to-do citizens who were accustomed to read for edification and for pleasure. Among them there arose from time to time men of literary ability and occasionally of genius who provided the literature which satisfied their demand. The common interest in these books is an interest in the problems of ordinary individual citizens, their relations with one another within their own communities, in their daily lives, their concern about the present and the future, including the fate of their children and descendants, and about the justice or injustice of their personal destinies. These are all perennial problems, and insofar as there were in every generation men who thought about them and made their thoughts known to others, there may be said to have been an intellectual tradition in Israel. That there should have been some continuity, though of a completely informal kind, of this intellectual tradition is natural. Hence the almost universal entanglement of academic wisdom discussions with questions about scribes and scribal schools and all the other side issues that have so vexed scholars for decades. We, however, cannot allow them to vex us any further. It is time to get back to the main thread of our discussion.
The second counterattack.
In this new wave of wisdom research, the focus was no longer on Amenemope per se, but rather on the wider issues of wisdom in general. Nevertheless, the study of Amenemope itself continued, albeit at a somewhat leisurely pace. In 1953, the Catholic Church released the third volume of what would ultimately become the New American Bible. It contained a new translation of Psalms, the Song of Songs, and all the biblical wisdom books, including the Book of Proverbs. For anyone who had followed the scholarly discussion about Amenemope and its relationship to the Book of Proverbs, it was obvious that the NAB translation of the words of the wise in Proverbs 22, 17, 24, 22 had been heavily influenced by that discussion. Most striking of all, the new translation actually inserted the name of Amenemope into the biblical text at Proverbs 22:19. A literal translation of the Hebrew for this verse reads, "That your trust may be in Yahweh, I teach you this day, even you." The second half of the verse makes little sense, and translators and exegetes had been wrestling with it for centuries without much success. The solution chosen by the NAB translators apparently takes the Hebrew consonants for "this day, even you" out my equals hi fmpt, to be a garbled version of the consonants for imna mpt, thereby yielding the rendering. "That your trust may be in the Lord, I make known to you the words of Amenemope." In 1954, Siegfried Hermann published a discussion of 4 motifs which commonly appear in the instructions, including Amenemope, the rudder, the balance, the heart, and the tongue. The next year, F.W. von Bissing published a new German translation as part of a larger collection of Egyptian didactic literature. After that, all was quiet for 2 years, and then came Driton. Etienne Driton was an Egyptologist, and he had no use for the infelicitous arguments advanced by R.O. Kevin in his attack on the Ehrman consensus. But neither did Driton have any use for Ehrman's theory of the priority of Amenemope over Proverbs. Instead, in a series of articles spanning several years, he argued that Amenemope was not really an Egyptian composition at all, but a badly executed translation of a barely understood Semitic original composed by a syncretizing Jew in Egypt. Pseudo-Amenemope would have known the old 30 maxims, brought by his fellow Israelite refugees into Middle Egypt. This collection continued to circulate in Palestine, where it was gathered up and incorporated by the compiler of the Book of Proverbs into his own work. But our Judeo-Egyptian scribe would have had the ambition of replacing the old writing in his community's usage with a work that was more literary, more significant, and especially more in conformity with mentality of his co-religionists, who were anxious to live on good terms with the practices of their Egyptian hosts. He amplified the text, albeit with a rather narrow inspiration, and out of a collection of 30 maxims, he constructed a work of 30 chapters. The original text, written in Hebrew, is lost, but its translation, after a fashion, into Egyptian, which was made by a lover of exotic wisdom, found a place among the wisdom literature of the Nile Valley under the name of the Instruction of Amenemope. This was, as Whybray later put it, an altogether surprising hypothesis, which not unexpectedly provoked a strong reaction from other Egyptologists. Unlike Esterly and Kevin, Driton was an Egyptologist, so he had to be taken seriously. On the other hand, his conclusion was so far out in space that it left his fellow Egyptologists gasping for breath. In essence, he was claiming that the Egyptian of Amenemope was not really Egyptian at all, but a kind of pidgin Egyptian, resulting from a word-for-word translation out of Hebrew by an Egyptian amateur. In support of this claim, he adduced numerous instances in which the words of the alleged Hebrew original had supposedly been transliterated rather than translated, the wrong Egyptian word had been chosen to translate a particular Hebrew word, and Hebrew idioms had been translated literally without any comprehension of their idiomatic sense. The first response to Driton came from Pierre Montet, whose 1959 book, L'Égypte et la Bible, included 17 pages about Amenemope. Montet, who was clearly a party to the Ehrman consensus, effectively disposed of Driton in a single sentence. One cannot read the Instruction of Amenemope without being struck by its authentically Egyptian character, a character that it could not possess to the same degree if its author had borrowed from a foreign work. Next came Turney, who took a few passing shots at Driton in the course of a much larger article about the chronology of the Psalms. After him came Courroyer, who published a pair of articles gently refuting Driton's assertions on a few specific points of translation and interpretation. The next response to Driton from R.J. Williams was considerably more pointed. While acknowledging his opponent's stature as an Egyptologist, Williams demonstrated in case after case that what Driton had pegged as Semitisms were in fact standard Egyptian grammatical features and literary expressions, which are amply attested in other Egyptian literary works of undeniable authenticity. He also pointed out that Amenemope contains at least 3 puns, which can only work in Egyptian, and therefore cannot have been derived from in a Hebrew original. In short, he said, Driton's thesis has little to recommend it. One suspects that in private he used less polite descriptors. The most important contribution of Williams' article came at the end, almost as a throwaway, in a comment on the eternal problem of dating Amenemope's original composition. It had long been realized by almost everyone that the whole issue of borrowing was heavily dependent on one's assumptions about the relative dates of Proverbs and Amenemope. Since no one considered Proverbs to be older than the establishment of the United Monarchy at Jerusalem in the 10th century BC, most indeed dated it centuries later than that, then any evidence for the existence of Amenemope prior to that time would clinch the argument once and for all. Several years earlier, Plumley had stated categorically that the Cairo Ostracon, which Posner had mentioned in passing, can be dated with some certainty to the latter half of the 21st dynasty, but he had given no reference for the claim and cited no authority to back it up. Williams now closed that loophole. He repeated Plumley's statement that the Cairo Ostracon could be firmly dated to the late 21st dynasty, and then dropped the bombshell that said dating had been done by none other than the acknowledged expert on the subject, Jaroslav Cerny. Furthermore, since the Ostracon had the character of a schoolboy practice exercise, one had to allow some time after Amenemope's composition for it to become popular and widely distributed. In short, Williams declared, we may well regard the work as originating as early as the 19th dynasty. 296. Poof, the deed was done. Cerny's authority was unquestionable, and the conclusions Williams had drawn from Cerny's evaluation were inescapable. Amenemope could not have borrowed from Proverbs, because Amenemope had demonstrably been composed centuries earlier than Proverbs could possibly have been. Hence, Proverbs must have borrowed from Amenemope.
The 60s and 70s.
The sense of assurance provided by Cerny's dating of the Cairo Ostracon sparked a new fluorescence of studies on Amenemope, which persisted through the 60s and into the 70s. In 1966, H. Schmid brought out in German a panoramic study of the relationship between Israelite wisdom literature and the related literatures of the ancient Near East. His statement of Das Problem in the opening chapter began with Budge's publication of the Instruction of Amenemope. Further testimony, if any, was needed to the pivotal role which Amenemope had played in bringing new life to the study of wisdom literature in the 20th century. Over the course of the next decade, Peterson and Posner published several new witnesses to the text of Amenemope, and in the process also re-examined the old ones. R.J. Williams brought out an important article summarizing the state of Egyptological research on the Hebrew Bible, including a review of the arguments on Amenemope to date, and a strong affirmation of its priority over Proverbs. Leo Perdue submitted a doctoral dissertation on wisdom literature's view of the religious cult in Egypt, Israel, and Mesopotamia, including a brief discussion of Amenemope's attitudes on the subject. G.E. Bryce detailed the process by which Egyptian didactic materials were adapted, assimilated, and ultimately integrated into the thought and scriptures of Israel. There were also numerous articles on the technical details of translation and interpretation, discussions of Amenemope's relationship to other literatures, a detailed syntactic structural analysis, a revised edition of Gemser's old German handbook on the Book of Proverbs, 2 new translations of Amenemope into English, a new translation into Spanish, and another translation into German. Perhaps most tellingly, general surveys of the literature and even mainstream commentaries on the Book of Proverbs now confidently and unapologetically treated borrowings from Amenemope as an established fact. But by far the most important developments during this period were a thesis and a dissertation. John Ruffles' 1964 MA thesis provided the first new hieroglyphic transcription and line-by-link commentary since Long in 1925.